Record-breaking protests largely led by students, characterized by peaceful and nonviolent marches and unbelievable self-control on the part of the protesters, followed by a massive and harsh government crackdown and lots of media spin. Sound familiar? Hong Kong has staged some of the most massive protests in the world history, rivaling those in the Arab Spring and those in Tiananmen long ago. These protests have been a long time coming, but largely began to protest the extradition bill that was close to passing the HK legislature. The bill would allow China to pick and choose tasty dissidents arrested in Hong Kong and forcibly extradite them to China for trial. If you're familiar with Chinese trials, you already know what the problem is.
They execute a lot of people in China, more than the rest of the world combined. Now, the official number is considered a state secret, but it's estimated to be somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000, whereas in 2012, the rest of the world executed just shy of 700 combined.
If you're not, just know that they're generally pretty short and are usually decided long before the plaintiff enters the courtroom. You see, Hong Kong has long been in that uncomfortable in-between stage with China. China's one country, two systems policy has been lauded, by Beijing, as the best and only way forward with the country. Attempts, even accidental, to name Hong Kong as their own independent country have been met with fierce backlash from Beijing. After Britain gave up colonial control over Hong Kong, the agreement essentially stated that they weren't necessarily not China's territory. China isn't too fond of that gray area and has increased the pressure under President Xi to take control of Hong Kong and HK politics. Hong Kong has their own language, Cantonese versus the widely spoken mainland language Mandarin, and writing system. Like Taiwan, they generally rely on much more confusing traditional writing system characters versus the simplified version used in the mainland. They have their own culture, a diverse economy, and largely don't really need Big Daddy She-Bear on or the baggage that comes with them. The extradition bill was the straw that broke the camel's back. Protesters, primarily college-aged and young adults, took to the streets by the hundreds of thousands, chanting "Fan Tong Zhong," which means "we oppose extradition to China." It sounds better in Chinese, doesn't translate well. I, for one, was surprised to see the general lack of response in the beginning of the protest. Protesters took over massive swaths of the city, eventually storming the legislative building and trashing it in protest to the policy that was being written there. They were fed up of the increasing Beijing control over the legislation, the unwillingness of their so-called leader Carrie Lam to step up to Xi to represent her constituents, and the general feeling that the only way for their thoughts to be heard being to take the streets and yell. For a while, it seems Beijing may have been listening. Then the white shirts came. The TV pundits roared into action, and the politicians and journalists called for military action in Hong Kong. Protesters and journalists were beaten by masked mobs in uniform who had clear ties with police and politicians in Hong Kong. The police watched as men and women were battered with clubs and left bleeding in the streets. They stood by as mobs trapped hundreds in subway stations, beating anyone who tried to leave. That was the first of what I fear to be many waves of violence. China is absolutely obsessed with harmony. They use the word constantly in political writings to reference general societal and political oneness and wholeness, and it even began to become a grammatical meme, as the word for harmony, hexie, was a homonym for the word for river crab. As China pushed the censorship narrative even further for the sake of harmony, online netizens began to fervently discuss river crab ecosystem that the net had become. China's obsession with harmony stems from an incredibly authoritarian history and directly implicates China's obsession with reunifying the mainland with Taiwan and Hong Kong. The more the pushback, the more likely and more harsh the government responds. It happened in Xinjiang after the Urumqi disturbances, and even earlier in Tiananmen. It happens anytime there is any level of organized mass protest, anytime anti-party voice just gets a little too loud. The boot comes down hard, and China's dogs are quick to come and lick it. After the Hong Kong protests and ensuing mob beatings, protests in Australia, particularly at the University of Queensland, got ugly when counter-protesters showed up to tear banners, intimidate, blast the national anthem of China, and get in fights. Man-babies and other universities destroyed pro-democratic statues. The Wu Mao Army, China's fervently supportive online social media bootlickers, deployed en masse. Hong Kong is a place to watch. The free world should be watching Beijing's hands, because the way they export force in Hong Kong is the same way they'll export force in Taiwan and elsewhere. I hope only for the patriots in Hong Kong to fight the good fight, and to do so as safely as one can. If the loudmouths of the party get their way, they'll be fighting a battle against one of the largest militaries the world has ever seen. If you take anything from this video, it is to pay attention. Read up, Ask me questions, ask smarter people than me questions, pay attention, become educated, and speak out. Thank you for the support. If you're watching this from Hong Kong, my thoughts and prayers are with you always. To everyone else, read up, spread this video far and wide, and spread the word. Thank you, and take it easy.